Good morning, everybody. This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Sinoland. And you are here for a reason, because you get a lot out of all of my work, research, publishing, podcasting, etc. China Rising, YouTube, SoundCloud, Brighteon, and BitChute. You can find quick links to support my work via PayPal, Patreon, and Fundraiser. Please take a moment and do that before getting started. Thank you. This one is unusual. This is I think this is my first co-written article, so I'm going to do a podcast reading of it here, and then if you want to read the actual article, please go to use the original hyperlink to patronize CovertAction magazine. Here it is. Fool's Crusade. Why United States provocations toward China will lead to disaster, by Jeff J. Brown and Jeremy Kuzmarov. CovertAction magazine, October 25th, 2020. Pictured above, East and West parting ways, led by China and USA respectively. Here we go. On July 4th, 2020, the U.S. Navy dispatched an unprecedented 2 aircraft carriers and 4 other warships to the South China Sea for naval maneuvers in waters claimed by China. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo subsequently broke with the official U.S. policy of neutrality in territorial conflicts in the South China Sea and declared that China's claims to most of the sea were, quote, completely unlawful, end of quote, though most of the disputed territories had been part of China prior to being taken over by Japan in the 1895 Sino-Japanese War. World War III nearly erupted on August 25, 2020, when a U.S. spy plane flew into Chinese airspace while the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, was conducting drills. Conversely, in 1963 and 1965, China shot down U-2 spy planes while capturing and imprisoning the pilots, though this time, with the international stakes much higher, Beijing did not take the bait. Provocative military policies have been accompanied by attempts to blame China for the spread of COVID-19, which President Donald Trump called, quote, Kung flu, end of quote. Trump's administration has also, 1, imposed high tariffs on China, 2, approved over $13 billion in arms sales to China's enemy, Taiwan, 3, helped fast-track $3 billion in sales of General Atomics drones to India, whose armed forces clashed with the Chinese in June, and 4, blacklisted Chinese companies for China's alleged aggression in the South China Sea. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stated in a speech at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California that, quote, if we want to have a free 21st century and not the Chinese century of which Xi Jinping dreams, the old paradigm of blind engagement with China simply won't get it done. We must not continue it, and we must not return to it. End of quote. On July 21st, the New York Times ran a front-page article highlighting the revival of the Committee on the Present Danger, a Cold War organization that called for greater military spending to meet the Soviet threat, but whose focus is now on China. Democratic Party contender Joe Biden has at times been even more hawkish than Trump, telling Foreign Affairs that the U.S. needed to get tough with China and calling Chinese leader Xi Jinping a thug who, quote, doesn't have a democratic bone in his body, end of quote. Biden and Trump's approach appears to be supported by much of the U.S. public, as a recent poll by the Pew Research Center found that 73% of Americans had an unfavorable view of China, the highest in at least 15 years. Subheading, is the U.S. jealous? There are a variety of factors underlying these negative views, but one clear one is jealousy. While American cities are plagued by riots, quality of life indicators drop, and the country implodes under Trump's presidency, China, despite glaring inequalities, is in many ways prospering and could conceivably supersede the U.S. as the dominant global power in the next half century. Significantly, in the last decade, China has taken the lead in the race for worldwide patents, outpaced America in education, and expanded its reach considerably in Africa, and launched the world's fastest supercomputer. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, has been more effective, and its economy is expected to surpass America's by around 2030. Over the past 40 years, China has lifted 850 million of its citizens out of poverty, and from 1978 to 2018 averaged an impressive 9.5% economic growth per year. According to the World Bank, China is the second largest economy in terms of gross domestic product since 2018, but number one in terms of per capita purchasing power. Since 2015, China also has the largest middle class in the world, whereas Americans rely on gas-guzzling automobiles and airplanes for travel. China has 36,000 kilometers of high-speed railway, serviced by trains running punctually and quietly over the countryside at over 350 kilometers per hour. One of Xi's trademark initiatives is the One Belt, One Road Initiative, abbreviated BRI, a global infrastructure development strategy to invest in nearly 70 countries and international organizations. The Belt part seeks to recreate the old Silk Road land trade route, and the Road part to create a sea-based trade route spanning several oceans. The initiative was to be consolidated through investments in large-scale gas and oil pipelines, roads, railroads, and ports, as well as connecting, quote, economic corridors, end of quote. The BRI further includes efforts at financial integration, cooperation in science and technology, cultural and academic exchanges, and the establishment of trade cooperation mechanisms. Although China has contracted with Eric Prince of Blackwater to carry out security and plans to build 50 special economic zones that enable great labor exploitation by encouraging foreign investors through low taxes and wages, one study found that so far the infrastructure projects advanced under BRI have increased GDP for participating economies by up to 3.35%, and social welfare by up to 2.81%. The BRI was designed in part as a form of pushback against Obama administration's pivot to Asia, which expanded the U.S. naval presence in the South China Sea, military base network in Southeast Asia, and arms sales to strategic proxies, and was combined with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, a free trade agreement pushing greater corporate and investor rights, excluding China. Ultimately, the United States repudiated the TPP and has been unable to compete with the BRI. It has responded by developing its own aid and pipeline projects in Central Asia, while continuing to advance color revolutions and sanctions along with military encirclement. The U.S. has around 132,000 troops stationed in the Asia-Pacific, including 55,000 in Japan and 26,000 in Korea, and territorial harassment in the South China Sea. China has been absorbing non-stop attacks from the U.S. since 1949, but what the Trump administration is doing may in fact be approaching what Uncle Sam did to goad Japan into declaring war in 1941. The latter measures included a large-scale naval buildup under FDR in the Pacific Seas, expanding military training and aid to Japan's adversaries, most notably China, and imposition of an economic embargo on oil, which was designed to cripple Japan's war machine and economy. Whether China would respond to America's provocations today with an attack like at Pearl Harbor is unlikely, though American policies are very dangerous nevertheless. Subheading, a further history lesson. If history is any judge, the U.S. strategy of provocation is bound to fail. Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War 2,500 years ago, was very clear on 2 points. 1. Avoid direct confrontation at all costs, and 2. When in doubt, retreat. China's national leaders are well versed in this work, as well as all the other key historical texts involving governance and geopolitics. The Chinese generally have a proud history of resisting Western imperialism, about which Americans are largely ignorant. This resistance goes back at least to the 1830s, when the British began plundering China and forced onto its people illegal drugs such as opium and later morphine and heroin. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's maternal grandfather, Warren Delano, made a fortune as a partner in the premier American drug trading firm in China, Russell and Company, which trafficked in opium. Another of history's biggest drug dealers, Queen Victoria, forced the ineffectual Qing dynasty to sign the outrageous Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, forfeiting Hong Kong Island and turning it into the drug and money laundering capital of the world. For thousands of years before, the Chinese had defended themselves mostly successfully and established the tributary system, where they provided economic aid and spread their civilization in exchange for gifts and displays of fealty to the emperor. Ironically, starting in the 14th century, Europeans had, quote, borrowed, end of quote, China's advanced maritime and weapons technologies, which they began using to conquer the rest of the world. Qing Emperor Dao Guang, 1820 to 1850, was unprepared for outsiders turning China's own high-tech innovations against itself and did not adapt fast enough. From that point on, the United States, France, England, Russia, Germany, and later Japan furthered their efforts to weaken China and exploit its resources. 1/4 of humanity, which for 5,000 years was centuries ahead of every Western and Eastern civilization in terms of agriculture, industry, infrastructure, weapons, exploration, science, technology, and innovation, was relegated to being dubbed the, quote, sick man of Asia, end of quote. During China's Civil War, 1927 to 1950, the 1921 founded Communist Party of China, CPC, and other anti-imperialist supporters began calling the West and Japan's pillage of their country their century of humiliation. With the concept of the Buddhist big wheel of life that keeps turning, 1839 became the people's symbolic cyclical nadir and a cry of resistance to start their long climb back to the top. The year 1839 was when Lin Zexu, the special commissioner to end the opium trade, and for you listeners, that's L-I-N and then Z-E-X-U, to end the opium trade, dumped more than 20,000 chests of opium sold by British merchants in the South China Sea. When the British subsequently defeated the Qing armies in the Opium Wars, they forced China to cede Hong Kong and pay large war indemnities, and solidified a neo-colonial economic arrangement and law by which British citizens would not be tried by local courts if they committed a crime on Chinese soil. 100 years later, on October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood overlooking a packed Tiananmen Square and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, whose mission was to reverse the previous century of humiliation. Within 2 years, the CPC had rid the country of drugs, prostitution, gambling, organized crime, and the Western theft and exploitation of China's human and natural resources. While mistakes were made in the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution, and the country has evolved in many respects into a capitalist oligarchy, the Chinese Revolution set China on a path to national restoration and independence. It also vastly improved the living standard of the people through the state's investment in healthcare, education, and its commitment to industrialization, full employment, and in theory, social equality. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had shocked the Western capitalist powers, but the Chinese Revolution of 1949, with 1/4 of the human race declaring their faith in communism, reverberated across the post-war Western Empire like a red tsunami. It was the driving force behind Harry Truman's paranoid domino theory, the rise of Joseph McCarthy's, quote, "Who lost China?" end of quote, hysteria, and America's ignominious wars in Korea and Indochina, which resulted in the slaughter of so many millions of Asians. China's intervention in Korea was a key step in ending China's century of humiliation. Fighting on the side of the North Korean troops, the People's Liberation Army dealt the U.S. military what Look magazine called its most, quote, "shameful disgrace," end of quote, since the Civil War, when Northern troops had, quote, "cut and run at the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861, end of quote. According to Min-Xin Pei, and that's M-I-N-X-I-N, and then family name Pei, P-E-I, a senior associate in the China program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Chinese nationalism was, quote, "partly a creation of Western imperialism," end of quote, which had generated an overwhelming desire to overcome historic atrocities perpetrated by the West. These range from the Opium Wars and British acquisition of Hong Kong to the support for the Kuomintang during this Chinese Civil War, which you may know as the KMT with Chiang Kai-shek, turning a blind eye to Japanese imperialism in the 1930s, and killing more than 900,000 Chinese troops in the Korean War, while General Douglas MacArthur threatened to drop nuclear bombs over China. I will also add, for you audiovisual fans, bioweapons bombs dropped by the United States on North Korea and China. In light of this history, recent provocations by the U.S. are not seen as isolated incidents by the Chinese, but as merely the latest in the long series of Western aggressions. The Chinese, according to Min-Xin, feel especially strongly about issues such as sovereignty and the integrity of their territory, and will vigorously mobilize in their defense because, quote, "they still have the historical memory of Western imperialism," end of quote. Subheading, China's Road to Rejuvenation. On November 29, 2012, China's current president, Xi Jinping, joined by the powerful members of the Politburo Standing Committee, went to the National Museum on Beijing's Tiananmen Square to announce that China was closer now than ever before to the objective of great rejuvenation, which had been pursued since the de facto British colonization in 1839. In his speech, Xi stated that, quote, "This nation of ours suffered very gravely after the beginning of the modern era. It made enormous sacrifices such as have rarely been seen in the history of the world. But because the Chinese people have never surrendered and incessantly rose with force and spirit to resist, we grasped hold of our own fate in the end," end of quote. The backdrop for Xi's speech was an exhibit at the museum called Road to Rejuvenation. The key word is rejuvenation, whose synonyms include renaissance, resurrection, revival, and resurgence. Notice they all start with RE, which means again. For the Chinese people, they will again reach the pinnacle of civilizational success. Road to Rejuvenation's story about modern China's resurgence starts characteristically in 1839, before the First Opium War. To enter the exhibit, you have to walk across a glass-enclosed case on the floor. Inside the case is a world map. The map shows the state of affairs across the globe in 1839, with arrows pointing to all the places where Western colonialists were pillaging most of humanity. The exhibit goes on to detail the Chinese people's 110-year-long march from Western and Japanese plunder and tyranny to freedom and liberation. After 1949, they portray China's Renaissance and re-rise through the Mao, Deng, Jiang, Hu, and now Xi eras. President Xi's guiding vision for governing China is the concept of the Chinese dream, which offers a riposte to the internationally coined American version. Xi stated that, quote, to realize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is the greatest dream the Chinese nation has had since modern times, meaning 1839, end of quote. The way to fulfill the rejuvenation and dream is by sustaining socialist ideals alongside a free market and promoting the BRI. Xi has further advanced the idea of a shared global community and shared future for mankind while pushing for the complete reunification of the motherland, which is understood to include the reabsorption of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. Though at once inspiring, especially when compared to the kind of political rhetoric coming out of Washington these days, Xi's vision is also in many ways contradictory and problematic because free market development and socialism are antithetical to one another. Xi also shows no inclination to want to advance the rights and interests of workers caught up in sweatshop labor or farmers suffered from predatory debt, nor is trying to counteract the growing political power of China's new class of billionaires. The call to reabsorb Taiwan could also lead to war. Nevertheless, one should be wary of the demonization of China and Xi and the underlying agenda behind it. Mike Pompeo gave ideological justification for the new Cold War. For example, when he stated in his speech at the Nixon Library that Xi was tyrannizing his people and that, quote, the free world must triumph over this new tyranny, end of quote. A similar rhetoric has emerged among liberals. The New York Review of Books, for example, published an article by Howard University professor Roderick Macfarquhar, M-A-C-F-A-R-Q-U-H-A-R. I actually know that name, but it's the first time I've actually had to pronounce it, Macfarquhar, which characterized Xi as a, quote, red emperor, end of quote, and referenced Willy Wolap, W-O-L-A-P, Lambs, L-A-M, so it's W-O-L-A-P-L-A-M. 2015 book, Chinese Politics in the Era of Xi Jinping, which suggested that Xi has centralized power to an unprecedented extent in modern times. This kind of negative characterization has helped validate the Obama administration's Asia pivot policy and its expansion under Trump. It is an example of human rights being adopted as a political weapon. Samantha Power, U.S. Ambassador to the UN under President Obama, and Susan Rice, a former National Security Council advisor, have routinely denounced Beijing's atrocities on ethnic Uyghurs and repression in Hong Kong and Tibet as a basis for expanding the American military arsenal in the South China Sea and pursuing confrontation in China. While certain criticisms of China's human rights record are warranted, the media and politicians fail to consider China's perspective. It maintains that the Uyghurs have sponsored terrorist attacks targeting Chinese citizens in Xinjiang, a hub for oil, gas, and coal, necessitating the establishment of detention camps, and that Hong Kong protesters are led by violent separatists backed by foreign powers. China has also long viewed American meetings with the Tibetan Dalai Lama as a serious interference in China's internal affairs and part of a campaign of destabilization dating back to the 1950s and targeting a province, Tibet, of key strategic importance. Tibet is a great water source. It also possesses the world's largest uranium and borax deposits, large oil reserves, enormous iron deposits, over 80,000 gold mines, and the largest timber reserves at China's disposal. Subheading: China's growing military might. President Xi leads the Central Military Commission, the PLA's highest decision-making body, which has committed to producing a, quote, world-class force, end of quote, that can dominate the Asia-Pacific and fight to win global wars by 2049. While spending less than half what the U.S. spends on the military, China has evolved as a world leader in artificial intelligence, AI, and anti-ship ballistic missiles, and is close to developing a hypersonic missile which can travel many times faster than the speed of sound. In August 2016, Beijing launched the world's first quantum satellite that transmits photons believed to be, quote, invulnerable to hacking, end of quote, 3 years after the Pentagon abandoned its own attempt at full-scale satellite security. A 2016 RAND Corporation study, War with China, predicted that by 2025, quote, China will likely have more, better, and longer-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles than the U.S., advanced air defenses, latest generation aircraft, quieter submarines, more and better sensors, and the digital communications, processing power, and cybersecurity, which they call C2. I've never heard that before. The letter C and the number 2, cybersecurity, necessary to operate an integrated kill chain. Nice. End of quote. That's for all you peaceniks out there. In the event of all-out war, Rand suggested the United States may suffer heavy losses to its carriers, submarines, missiles, and aircraft from Chinese strategic forces, while its computer systems and satellites would be degraded and destroyed by improved Chinese cyber war and ASAT, anti-satellite capabilities. Even though American forces would counterattack, their growing vulnerability means Washington's victory would not be assured. In such a conflict, the report concluded, there might well be no clear winner. Historian Alfred W. McCoy, MCCOY, urges us to, quote, make no mistake about the weight of those words. For the first time, a top strategic think tank closely aligned with U.S. military and long famous for its influential strategic analyses, was seriously contemplating a major war with China that the United States would not win. End of quote. Prominent Chinese defense intellectuals like Shen, S-H-E-N, Dingley, D-I-N-G-L-I, of Fudan University, have long rejected the idea of countering the U.S. with a big naval buildup and argued instead for, quote, cyber attacks, space weapons, lasers, pulses, and other direct energy beams, end of quote. Instead of rushing to launch aircraft carriers that will be burned by lasers fired from space, China should, Shen argued, develop advanced weapons to make other command systems fail to work. End of quote from Shen. Although decades away from matching the full might of Washington's global military, China could, through a combination of cyber war, space warfare, and supercomputing, find ways to cripple U.S. military communications and thus blind its strategic forces. Then China would have definitively overcome its century of humiliation and completed the road to national rejuvenation that began in 1839 and was bolstered by the Maoist Revolution of 1949. This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Sinoland, signing out. Thank you. Bye-bye.